Life has a way of throwing you into situations you never imagined you'd find yourself in. One minute, everything feels certain, like you have it all figured out, and the next, your world is turned upside down. I'm Claire, a 33-year-old woman married to my husband, Jonathan, for 8 years. We live a quiet life in a charming suburban neighborhood with our 2 kids, Noah and Lily. Jonathan and I have been through a lot together, raising a family, juggling careers, and trying to keep our marriage strong amid the chaos. But lately, I've felt like we've been drifting apart, as if we're just going through the motions without really connecting. My best friend, Jessica, has been my rock through it all. We've known each other since college, and we've always been inseparable. She's the person I call when I need to vent, when I want to celebrate something, or even when I just want to sit in silence. Jessica and her husband, David, moved to our neighborhood about 2 years ago, and since then, we've spent countless weekends together, barbecues, family dinners, and the occasional wine night when we'd let loose and laugh until our stomachs hurt. Jessica and David had what seemed like the perfect marriage. They were always affectionate, always seemed in sync. I looked up to them, honestly. They were that couple that made marriage look effortless, like they were still madly in love after years together. But as I've come to realize, things aren't always what they seem. It all started one evening when Jonathan was out of town for work. He had been traveling a lot lately, and I was feeling particularly lonely. Jessica had invited me over for a wine night, but at the last minute she had to cancel because one of her kids wasn't feeling well. I understood, of course, but I couldn't shake the disappointment. It had been a rough week, and I was really looking forward to unwinding with my best friend. Later that evening, just as I was about to settle in with a glass of wine and a movie, there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I was surprised to see David standing there, holding a bottle of wine and wearing a warm smile. "Hey, Claire," he said, his voice light. "I heard Jessica had to cancel on you tonight. Thought I'd stop by with this and see if you needed some company. I know how lonely it can get when Jonathan's away." I hesitated for a moment, unsure if it was appropriate for us to hang out alone like this, but then I figured, why not? David was Jessica's husband, and we were all close. Besides, I didn't want to spend the night alone, wallowing in my thoughts. "Sure, come in," I said, stepping aside to let him in. We sat in the living room, the wine flowing as we made small talk. At first, everything was light and casual. David talked about work, the kids, and how Jessica had been handling everything lately. But as the night wore on, the conversation took a more personal turn. We started talking about our marriages, about the challenges we were both facing. "I don't know, Claire," David said, his voice tinged with frustration. "Sometimes it feels like Jessica and I are more like roommates than husband and wife. We're both so busy with work and the kids that we barely have time for each other anymore." "I'm sure you can relate." I nodded, feeling a pang of guilt as I thought about my own marriage. "Yeah, it's been tough lately. Jonathan's always traveling, and when he is home, we're both so exhausted that we barely talk. It's like we're living parallel lives." David leaned back on the couch, swirling the wine in his glass. "It's hard, isn't it? You get married thinking it's going to be this incredible partnership, but then life gets in the way, and before you know it, you're just going through the motions." I sighed, nodding in agreement. "Exactly. It's like the spark is gone, and I don't know how to get it back." We sat in silence for a moment, both of us lost in our thoughts. I hadn't realized how much I needed to talk about this, to voice my frustrations out loud, but as the conversation continued, I started to notice something. David was looking at me differently. There was an intensity in his gaze that I hadn't seen before, a heat that made my stomach flutter. "I've always admired you, Claire," he said quietly, his eyes locked on mine. "You're an incredible woman. Jonathan's lucky to have you." His words caught me off guard, and I felt a flush rise to my cheeks. "Thank you, David," I said, trying to brush it off as a harmless compliment. "That's really sweet of you to say." But David didn't let it go. He set his glass down on the coffee table and leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low, almost intimate tone. "No, I mean it. You're smart, beautiful, and you've got this strength about you that I've always admired. I don't think Jonathan realizes how lucky he is. My heart was racing now, a mix of confusion and something else. Something I didn't want to name. I should have stopped the conversation right there, should have told him to leave before things went any further. But I didn't. Instead, I just sat there, staring at him, my mind spinning. "I don't know what to say," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You don't have to say anything," David replied, his gaze never wavering. "I just wanted you to know how I feel." Before I could process what was happening, David reached out and gently took my hand in his. The touch was electric, sending a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. I should have pulled away, should have told him that this was wrong, that we couldn't do this. But I didn't. Instead, I let him hold my hand, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. This was Jessica's husband, my best friend's husband. I couldn't let this happen. But as much as I tried to convince myself to stop, there was a part of me that didn't want to. A part of me that was drawn to David in a way that I couldn't explain. The moment stretched on, and before I knew it, David was leaning in, his lips brushing softly against mine. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I kissed him back, my hand moving to his shoulder as I deepened the kiss. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other. "David," I whispered, my voice filled with both regret and longing. "We can't do this." "I know," he murmured, his eyes still closed, "but I can't help it. I've been wanting this for so long." We sat there in silence, the weight of what we had just done settling over us like a heavy fog. I knew we had crossed a line, that there would be consequences, but in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. "I don't know what this means," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Neither do I," David replied, his voice equally soft. "But I know I don't want this to be the last time." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt a pang of guilt as I thought about Jessica, about Jonathan. This wasn't fair to them. We were both betraying the people we loved, and yet there was a part of me that didn't want to stop. "I need some time to think," I said, pulling away from him. David nodded, his expression pained. "I understand. Take all the time you need." As he left that night, I sat on the couch, my mind racing with everything that had just happened. I knew I had made a mistake, that I had let my emotions get the better of me. But the truth was, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions. I couldn't stop thinking about that night with David, about the way he had made me feel. It had been so long since I had felt desired, truly seen by someone. Jonathan and I had been married for 8 years, but somewhere along the way, our connection had faded. We still loved each other, of course, but the spark that had once defined our relationship had dimmed. Life had gotten in the way. Work, kids, responsibilities, and we had stopped putting each other first. David had stirred something inside me, something I hadn't even realized I was missing. But that didn't make it right. I knew that what we had done was a betrayal, not just of Jessica, but of my own marriage. And yet, as much as I tried to push those feelings aside, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him. A few days later, I ran into Jessica at the park. We were both there with our kids, and it felt like any other day, just two best friends catching up. But as we talked, I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. She had no idea what had happened between David and me, no idea that the man she loved had kissed me, had confessed feelings for me. I felt like a fraud, standing there pretending everything was normal when I was hiding such a huge secret. "How have you been?" Jessica asked, her tone casual. "I feel like we haven't had a proper catch-up in a while." I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, it's been a little hectic lately, with Jonathan traveling and all." She nodded sympathetically. "I get it. David's been working long hours too, and it's been hard. Sometimes I feel like we barely see each other." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Here she was, confiding in me about her marriage, about her struggles, and I was betraying her behind her back. I wanted to tell her the truth, to confess everything and clear the air, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It would destroy her, and I couldn't be the one to break her heart. "Yeah, it's tough," I said, my voice tight with emotion, "but I'm sure things will get better." As the conversation continued, I found myself distracted. my thoughts drifting back to David. I hadn't seen him since that night, and I wasn't sure how to feel about that. Part of me was relieved, grateful for the distance that allowed me to think clearly, but another part of me missed him, missed the way he had looked at me, the way he had made me feel. Later that evening, after I had put the kids to bed, I received a text from David. "Can we talk?" My heart raced as I stared at the message, unsure of how to respond. I knew I should ignore it, should let things cool down before they got even more complicated. But the pull was still there, the temptation too strong to resist. "Sure. What's on your mind?" We agreed to meet the next day while Jessica was at work. It felt wrong, sneaking around like this, but I told myself that we needed to talk things through, to figure out what was happening between us and how to move forward. When David arrived at my house the next afternoon, there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. We sat in the living room, the conversation awkward at first, both of us unsure of how to start. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," David said finally, breaking the silence. "And I can't stop thinking about you, Claire. I know this is complicated, and I know it's wrong, but I can't deny how I feel." His confession sent a wave of emotions crashing over me. Excitement, guilt, fear. I had been thinking about him too, replaying that kiss in my mind over and over again. But as much as I was drawn to him, I knew we couldn't keep going down this path. "David, we can't do this," I said, my voice firm, even as my heart ached. "Jessica is my best friend, and you're her husband. I care about you, but this isn't fair to anyone." "I know," he replied, his expression pained, "but I can't stop thinking about you, about what could be between us. I haven't felt this way in years, Claire. Not with Jessica, not with anyone." His words hit me hard, and for a moment I was tempted to give in, to let myself fall into this whirlwind of emotion. But I couldn't. I couldn't betray Jessica, and I couldn't destroy my own marriage. "We need to stop," I said, standing up and putting distance between us. "This is going to hurt too many people, David. We can't keep doing this." He nodded, though I could see the conflict in his eyes. "You're right. I know you're right. But that doesn't make it any easier." We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of our decision pressing down on us. I knew this was the right thing to do, but that didn't make it any less painful. Letting go of David felt like losing something important, something I hadn't even realized I needed until now. As he left that day, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. I had made the right choice, but a part of me couldn't help but wonder what might have been if things were different, if we were free to explore whatever this was between us. The weeks that followed were difficult. I threw myself into my family, trying to rebuild the connection with Jonathan that had been slipping away for so long. We started going on date nights again, spending more time together, and slowly I began to feel like we were reconnecting. But even as things improved between Jonathan and me, I couldn't shake the memory of David. We hadn't spoken since that day, and every time I saw Jessica, the guilt gnawed at me. She had no idea what had happened, and I couldn't help but feel like I was betraying her every time I smiled and pretended that everything was fine. Then one evening, I received a text from Jessica. "Hey, can we talk?" I felt my stomach drop as I read the message. Did she know? Had David told her? My mind raced with a million possibilities, and I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over me. "Of course. Is everything okay?" Her response was immediate. "No, not really. Can I come over?" My heart pounded in my chest as I waited for her to arrive. When she knocked on the door, I opened it to find her standing there, her eyes red and puffy from crying.